My name is Margaret Calloway. I am 63 years old. And on the morning of my 61st birthday, I found a birthday card on our kitchen counter, signed by my husband, Robert, that said, 32 years. You are my whole world. I made coffee. I read it twice. I cried a little, the way you cry when something is genuinely sweet and you are genuinely happy. And then, 6 hours later, I found a photograph in the pocket of his winter coat. A woman. 2 children. A boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old. And written on the back, in handwriting I did not recognize. Always. Claire, Noah, and Lily. I stood in our bedroom holding that photograph for a very long time. 32 years. My whole world. I had no idea how large that world actually was. Let me tell you about Robert Calloway, because you cannot understand what I discovered without first understanding what I believed. Robert and I met in Portland, Oregon, in 1989. I was 29. He was 31. He was an architectural engineer, careful, precise, quietly brilliant in the way that some people are brilliant without needing anyone to notice. He wore the same style of watch for 20 years. He had strong opinions about coffee and almost none about anything else. He was steady. That was the word I always used. Robert was steady. I was a high school art teacher. I loved color and noise and the particular chaos of 22 teenagers discovering that they could make something beautiful. Robert loved order. We balanced each other in the way that people sometimes do when they are genuinely well matched, not because they are the same, but because they fill in each other's edges. We married in 1991. We bought a house in Beaverton. We had 2 daughters, Diane, born in 1993, and Ruth, born in 1996. We built a life that was, by every measure I had access to, a good one. Robert traveled for work. That was simply part of who he was and what he did. Structural projects took him to Seattle, to Sacramento, to Phoenix, sometimes for weeks at a time. I never questioned it seriously. I was busy. I was teaching full-time, raising 2 daughters, managing a household, being a person. The travel was background noise. Expected. Ordinary. He always called when he was away. Every night, without fail. He always came home with small gifts, nothing extravagant. Just the kind of thing that says I thought of you. A particular jam from a farmer's market. A paperback he'd seen in an airport bookstore that he thought I'd like. Once, memorably, a ceramic mug from a studio in Sacramento painted with the most extraordinary shade of cerulean blue that I still have in my cabinet to this day. I loved him. I want to be very clear about that. I loved Robert Calloway genuinely, with the specific texture of love that grows from 3 decades of small decisions and shared mornings, and the accumulated weight of a life built together. I loved a man who did not entirely exist. Our daughters grew up and moved away. Diane is in Chicago now. She works in urban planning, which Robert always said was the perfect combination of our 2 personalities. Ruth is in Austin, teaching elementary school. Both of them married. Both of them happy, as far as I can tell, in the way that adult children are happy when they are still figuring out what happiness means to them. Robert retired at 62. I retired at 60. We entered that particular season that people call the golden years, which is a phrase I always found slightly suspicious, too shiny, too confident, as though someone had tested it and verified the gold content. We traveled. We gardened. We had dinner with friends on Friday nights and took long walks on Sunday mornings. Robert seemed, if anything, more relaxed in retirement than he had been during the working years. More present. More attentive. I thought, this is what it's supposed to look like. We made it to this. We did it right. My 61st birthday was a Tuesday. Robert made me breakfast, eggs and toast, and the particular strong coffee he knew I liked, and left the card on the counter before going to run errands. It was a beautiful card. Hand-selected. Not the kind you grab at the last minute. He had written 3 sentences inside in his careful, architectural handwriting. 32 years. You are my whole world. There is no one I would rather have spent this life with. 6 hours later, I found the photograph. I want to describe what happened inside me when I found it, because I think people often imagine that a discovery like this produces immediate clarity, a clean break between before and after, like a bone snapping. It doesn't work that way. Not for me. What I felt first was confusion. Pure, disorienting confusion. My brain offered several explanations in rapid sequence: a niece I didn't know about, a colleague's family, a photograph left in the coat by mistake. Each explanation arrived and was assessed and quietly discarded within seconds. Then I felt cold. Not emotionally. Physically cold. The way you feel when your body understands something before your mind is willing to confirm it. Then I felt absolutely, unnervingly calm. I put the photograph in my cardigan pocket. I finished folding the laundry. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. I did not confront Robert that evening. I am a deliberate person. I have always been a deliberate person. And I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that whatever I was about to discover, I needed to discover it fully before I said a single word. Robert came home. I made dinner. We watched television. I handed him his tea at 9 o'clock and watched his hands, those steady, careful hands, and felt something in my chest like a stone dropping slowly through deep water. I slept beside him that night. I did not sleep well. Over the following 3 weeks, I investigated my own marriage. I want to say that plainly, without drama, because I think the plainness of it is important. I did not hire anyone immediately. I started with what I had access to: 32 years of shared financial records, tax returns, phone bills going back as far as I could find them. Robert was organized. Everything was filed and labeled. It took me 4 days to understand what I was looking at, and when I understood it, I sat in our home office for a very long time. There was a second account. Not a secret account, exactly, it was in Robert's name, which was perfectly legal, and I had technically known it existed as a savings account he managed separately. What I had not known was what it was actually for. Regular transfers, consistent for decades, to an address in Sacramento. The same Sacramento he visited so often for work. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Donna, and she was 64 years old and entirely without sentimentality, which was exactly what I needed. Within 10 days, she had confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Robert had a second family in Sacramento. A woman named Claire Hennessy, whom he had met in 1994, 3 years into our marriage, 1 year after Diane was born. They had 2 children together, Noah, now 28, and Lily, now 26. Robert had been supporting them financially for nearly 3 decades. He had maintained what Donna described, with professional detachment, as a remarkably consistent double life. Noah and Lily were older than I had guessed from the photograph. It was an old photograph. I sat with that for a moment. 28 and 26. My daughters were 30 and 27. Our children had grown up in parallel, on opposite ends of the state, with no knowledge of each other's existence. I thought about Claire Hennessy. I thought about what she knew and what she didn't know. I thought about whether she was a victim of the same deception I was, or a willing architect of it. Donna told me, gently, that the answer to that question was complicated. I told Donna I needed a week. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Susan Park. She was a family law attorney in Portland, with a reputation for being exceptionally good and exceptionally unafraid. A colleague of mine had used her years ago for a relatively simple matter, and said she was the kind of attorney who read a case the way I read a painting, seeing not just what was there, but what was underneath. I told Susan everything. I showed her the photograph, the financial records, Donna's report. She listened without interrupting. She took careful notes. When I was finished, she was quiet for a moment, And then she said, "Margaret, I want to be sure you understand what you have here. This isn't just a betrayal. This is 30 years of financial decisions made jointly, assets accumulated jointly, and a pattern of funds being diverted from the marital estate that may have legal consequences beyond the divorce itself." She explained what that meant in practical terms. Oregon is an equitable distribution state. The marital estate, our house, our retirement accounts, our investments, the properties we had purchased together over the years, was subject to division. But because Robert had been systematically diverting marital funds to support a second household for nearly 3 decades, Susan believed we had grounds to argue for a substantially larger share of the remaining assets as compensation for what had been taken. She also noted carefully that the second account, the one in Robert's name alone, contained assets that might themselves be considered marital property, depending on how they had been funded. I asked her what she needed from me. She gave me a list. I spent the next 3 weeks compiling every document she asked for with the same methodical attention I had brought to hanging student artwork. Everything level, everything in its place, everything exactly right. I did not tell Robert. I continued to make dinner. I continued to sleep beside him. I continued to watch his hands and think about 32 years and what it means to build a life on a foundation that was only ever partially true. On a Thursday morning in March, 6 weeks after my 61st birthday, Susan filed the petition. Robert was served at 9:15 in the morning while I was at the garden center buying tomato seedlings. I had planned it that way. Not out of cruelty. Out of the simple understanding that I could not be in the room when it happened and maintain the composure I needed to maintain. He called me 11 times between 9:15 and noon. I bought the tomato seedlings. I drove home. I planted them in the back garden. And then I went inside and called him back. He came home that afternoon. I was sitting in the living room. I had made tea. I make tea the way some people make fists, as a reflex when I need to hold something. And I was sitting in the chair by the window, the one I've had for 20 years, and I waited. He came in. He looked at me. He sat down across from me. He said, "Margaret." I said, "I know about Claire. I know about Noah and Lily. I know about Sacramento. I know about the account. I know about all of it, Robert. I have known for 6 weeks." He went very still. Robert has always gone still when he is calculating something. I had watched it for 32 years and called it steadiness. I understood now that it was not steadiness. It was the quiet of a person who never stops thinking about the next move. He said, "I can explain," I said. "I'm not interested in an explanation. I'm interested in you understanding what is happening. My attorney has filed for divorce. The petition covers the marital estate, including the funds you have been diverting for the past 28 years. You will be hearing from your own attorney about the specifics, and I recommend you find a good one." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "How did you find out?" I said, "Your coat pocket. A photograph. Our birthday." Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt, something more complicated than that. A recognition, maybe, that 30 years is a long time to keep a secret, and that the keeping of it had required a sustained, ongoing choice to look at me every single day and continue the deception. And that I had found the seam in it from something as small and human as checking his coat pockets for laundry. He said, "I love you. I want you to know that I genuinely love you." I said, "I know you do, Robert. I think that's possibly the saddest part of all of this." I stood up. I told him that his things were in the guest room and that I'd appreciate if he found somewhere else to stay within the week. He nodded. He looked suddenly smaller than I had ever seen him, not in a satisfying way, not in a triumphant way, but in the way that people look when the architecture they've built around themselves finally gives way, and there is nothing left to hold the shape. I went to the kitchen. I made more tea. I stood at the window and looked at the tomato seedlings in the back garden, just starting to find their footing in the soil, and I breathed. The divorce took 14 months. Robert's attorney was competent, but not exceptional, which was his misfortune. Susan Park was exceptional, and she had 30 years of documented financial behavior to work with. The final settlement reflected the full weight of what Robert had taken from our marital estate over nearly 3 decades, not just in diverted funds, but in compounded value, in investments never made. In the financial future that had been quietly redirected, without my knowledge or consent. I kept the house. I received a substantially larger share of the retirement accounts than a standard split would have produced. There were additional settlements related to the secondary account. I am not going to give you exact numbers. What I will tell you is that I am comfortable. That I will not have to worry about money for the rest of my life. And that Susan Park remains one of the people I am most grateful to have found when I needed her. Claire Hennessy, for what it's worth, was also not entirely what I had feared. Donna's original assessment, that the situation was complicated, proved accurate. Claire had known Robert was married. She had also, according to what Robert eventually told our daughters, genuinely believed for years that he was going to leave me, and had spent decades in a waiting room of her own making. I do not excuse her choices. But I also did not spend much energy on her. She was not my problem to solve. Telling Diane and Ruth was the hardest thing I did in those 14 months. Not the legal proceedings, not the financial negotiations, not even the sleepless nights in the first weeks when the full reality of what I had been living in kept arriving in new ways, like a tide that wouldn't finish coming in. Telling my daughters. Diane cried and then went very quiet, which is what Diane does when she is processing something large. Ruth asked me 3 times if I was okay before I finally said, "Ruth, I need you to be upset right now so I can be the one who is okay." And she said, "Okay, Mom," and burst into tears, and we sat on the phone together for an hour just breathing. They were furious at Robert in the specific, scorching way that daughters are furious when a parent has wronged the other parent. That fury has softened over time, not dissolved, but changed shape. Robert is their father. They have chosen to maintain a relationship with him, cautiously, on their own terms. I have never told them what to do with that. I am 63 now. I still live in the house in Beaverton. I grow tomatoes in the back garden every summer and they are, without exception, extraordinary. I have kept the cerulean blue mug, not because of what it represents, but because it is genuinely a beautiful object and I refuse to let his choices take my appreciation of beautiful things. I returned to painting, something I had stopped doing in my 40s, because there never seemed to be time. I have a studio now in what used to be Robert's home office. I have filled it with color. I have sold 3 pieces. I am working on a 4th. I have a life that is, in its 2nd chapter, more fully mine than it has ever been. Smaller in some ways. Louder in others. True in a way the previous version, for all its genuinely good moments, never quite was. I think about what it means to love someone who is not entirely real. I think about it the way I think about the mug, with complexity, without simple conclusions. Robert was real in some ways. The love between us was real in some ways. The life was real, even if the man was not entirely. And I genuinely believe, that the 61-year-old woman who found that photograph in a coat pocket and went still and made a cup of tea and thought carefully about what to do next was perhaps the truest version of herself she had ever been. She knew what she was worth. She found someone who could help her prove it. And she planted tomatoes. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar, or made you think of someone who needed to hear it, please hit that like button and leave a comment below. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what part hit hardest. These stories matter, because you make them matter. Share this with someone who needs to know. Discovery is not the end. It can be the beginning of something that is finally, completely yours. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Justice Served Tales. Every week, real stories of real people who refuse to be finished. Real stories. Real strength. Real justice. I'll see you next day.